Okay, so apparently I lied at lunch that you do have to hear from me one last time. Before I forget, right after the closing remarks, we have a cocktail reception down on the fourth floor again, so I hope you all can stay and join us for that and have a chance to talk to other folks as well. At the beginning of the morning, I asked what is a smart city, and frankly, I'm not sure if we're that much closer to really understanding it at this point, but we've really covered a lot of interesting ground, and I think there are a lot of takeaway points. That it is about information, and it's about information that empowers people to make better decisions. But one of the things is not only just information networks, but one of the things that's also critical to this is social networks and the social community and the value of community. We think of New York City, and New York City is really a neighborhood, a community of neighborhoods and a city of neighborhoods, and that's an important component here. Not only the large-scale development, but also the community development. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Rose as our closing keynote. I think he'll provide an excellent bookend to the way Professor Glaser started us off. Jonathan Rose's business, public policy, and not-for-profit work all focus on creating a more environmentally, socially, and economically responsible world. In 1989, Mr. Rose founded Jonathan Rose Companies, LLC, a multidisciplinary real estate development, planning, consulting, and investment firm, as a leading green urban solutions provider. The firm currently manages over $1.3 billion worth of work, much of which is in close collaboration with not-for-profits, towns, and cities. A thought leader in the smart growth, national infrastructure, green building, and affordable housing movements, Mr. Rose is a frequent speaker and writer. His work has won awards from a wide range of notable organizations, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Resources Defense Council, Global Green USA, the Urban Land Institute, the APA, and the American Institute of Architects as well. Mr. Rose is a trustee of several organizations, including the ULI, the NRDC, and vice chair of Enterprise Community Partners. He serves on numerous leadership councils, for example, the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Yale School of Architecture, and chairs the Trust for Public Lands National Real Estate Council. Mr. Rose also serves on the board of the Brooklyn Academy of Music and the American Museum of Natural History, and is a co-founder of the Garrison Institute with his wife, Diana Rose, where he leads the Climate Mind and Behavior program, which is a kind of a fantastic initiative, leading change in behavioral patterns. Mr. Rose graduated from Yale University in 1974 with a BA in psychology and philosophy, and received his master's in regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania in 1980. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Rose.
Thank you. So my definition of a smart city is a city that has the Shack Institute in it. So I only got here this afternoon, but this really strikes me as been an amazing program. I found the last panel really interesting and very, very forward-thinking. I actually, how do I get this to become a PowerPoint? I'm a Mac guy, so I don't know how to use it. Great, perfect. So I actually created this presentation before I heard the last panel, so I'm going to try and adjust a little bit. Okay. So first of all, this is a slide of what's going on in Egypt. And I want to frame everything I say by saying that we live in a world that the military calls a VUCA world, V-U-C-A. And it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. When I was growing up in the real estate business, it was a world of, although we had tremendous volatility in economic cycles, even the cycles were in some ways predictable, but the world was very stable. And we now live in a world that is very unstable and very unpredictable. And this actually affects everything that we do. And if there's one takeaway from my talk, and it really builds on what others have said, we need to move from static planning systems, economic systems, valuation systems, to dynamic systems, because we are being swamped with multiple inputs, and it actually requires a new way of thinking and responding. So I'm just going to give you a little example. This is about climate change. This happens to be a volcano in Peru, and this volcano erupted in 1598. And this is who was then the leader of Russia. The Tsar was then named Boris Godunov. They wrote an opera about him. And in 1600, Russia began to have incredibly cold winters from this climate event. At the same time, the Russian people, the Russian population was becoming wealthy, and the landlords were taking all their funds and using it to buy silk clothes from China, and there was a lot of conspicuous consumption going on, and therefore a third of the people in Russia died because the people were not storing enough grains. To go through these very cold winters, and when these great cold snaps came and actually dryness came, and as a result of the Russian people, the whole system got destabilized, and the nearby Poles actually took over. I tell you this story to say that, so it was an event in Peru. This happened in the late 1500s. An event in Peru completely toppled the government in Russia and caused the death of a third of the people. So think about the impacts of climate change that are going to affect us now that we have human cause, because we're going to have both the natural occurrences and add on top of it all the effects of the human cause. The point about this is that the world has always globally been interconnected. It is even more so. And so, for example, the destabilization that is going on in the Middle East, which we hope will give rise to an enormous new burgeoning of democracy, is not going to be smooth. And we're going to see dramatic effects in oil prices. We're going to see effects in the flow of monies. I have no idea whether this is good for the T-bill or bad for the T-bill, but what I do know is it's going to affect the T-bill. And it'll probably affect it well in some days and poorly in other days. A little bit more about globalization, the interconnection of the world. Everything on the left side of the chart is a producing part of the world, and everything on the right side is a receiving part of the world. And so, for example, the top bar says Europe, and then it goes Asia. The black bar is Asia. So take a look at Asia. What you'll see is, you notice, so the middle chunk of this bar shows that Asia is creating stuff, and it's selling it to Asia. But then there are pieces that are going all over the place. But see how these lines of interconnection are connected, and they're getting increasingly interconnected. What this actually means is that economically, those cities that are the most globally connected are simultaneously the ones that are most likely to be prosperous and the ones that are most likely to be vulnerable. So this is part of this VUCA world. So this interconnection is very, very important. If you look at the prosperity of American cities, it's the ones on the coast, it's the one with the international airports, it's the ones that are attracting international intellectual capital, that are the ones, and financial capital, such as New York City, are the cities that are prospering and are going to be the most prosperous. And it is clear that the Midwestern cities and some of the cities that are much less globally connected are less likely to prosper. But at the same time, it means our fate is in many more people's hands. This is all, I'm building a theme that says that connectivity is essential, but what comes with it is resilience. Remember the example I gave of the Russian czars? By overconsumption, they didn't have enough grain to help them survive through the unexpected. We're going to have a lot more unexpected, and therefore we need to be saving economically, from an energy point of view, from many points of view, resources. This is the top 30 internet routes. So this is another version of connectivity. I just talked to you about financial connectivity and physical connectivity. We also have data connectivity. And clearly those cities that are on the mainstream data map are the cities that have much more economic activity and are going to prosper more than the ones that are not. But they need the ability to manage it. And what we heard earlier from IBM and others is how important the real-time management of the flow of information is going to be. Now you need to take everything that I said globally and nationally and think about it in a nested series of scales. So for example, one of the great assets of New York City is this amazing transit system that connects to our suburbs and our regions. It's the reason why places like Stamford, Connecticut are thriving. I don't know if you know, but more people actually go from New York City to Stamford every day to work than go from Stamford and Greenwich to New York. Because it's bright young people in the financial services industry, but who want to live in a place like New York City. This infrastructure is extremely important, and this was built mostly over the last 100 years, and most of it 100 years ago. I think that the decision by the governor of New Jersey to kill the ARC project is devastating for much of New Jersey. It was a foolish long-term economic and even short-term economic development strategy. It is very clear. I spent the morning in a seminar about where is capital flowing, and it's very clear that capital is flowing in the future in denser, more transit-based locations. And by taking a whole bunch of cities like Patterson that just all of a sudden got disconnected by that decision are not going to see the capital flows. I want to talk to you a little bit more about long-term thinking. So in 275, there was an emperor in Rome. This is my only two emperors in the talk. So there's an emperor in Rome named Diocletian, and Diocletian, back then, by the way, if you were an emperor, you were very likely to die in office. So he said, look, here's what I'm going to do. I got a bunch of things I'm going to do them, and then I'm going to retire. And the way you know I'm going to retire is I'm going to build this palace in what was the coast of Croatia, what is today the coast of Croatia, and the city is split. And when I'm all done, I'm splitting. I'm going there. And in fact, he actually did in about 300. The palace was done 302, and he moves there. And the palace was designed for 10,000 people. But it had a water system that was designed for 175,000 people. This is in the year 300. Split only reached a population that exceeded 175 about 5 years ago. And so he actually designed an infrastructure system. The Visigoths ruined it for a little while, but basically that lasted for 1,700 years. Look at the amazing New York City water system, an infrastructure system that we are living off today. Now, we need, exactly as we heard earlier, to make it smarter. We need the behavioral feedback systems that we heard about. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We need the digital control systems. We need these, so we need to take all that smart intelligence, but we need to connect it to durable, complex infrastructure systems that go from multiple sources. Atlanta almost ran out of water because it only really had one source of water. The other thing we need is density, and I just want to point out that density is a long-term American tradition. This is the Anasazi ruins in the southwest, Mesa Verde. They were building multi-story apartment buildings that are very dense. We cannot support great infrastructure without density. This is one of the issues that often comes up politically between neighborhoods and larger cities, and certainly in suburban rezonings. One of the interesting things that's happened, this is a photo of the Lower East Side taken by Jacob Riis. So in the late 1800s, as we had huge immigrant populations in New York City, we became too dense, or we did not have the health infrastructure to support the density. And so there was a natural desire to de-densify. And it was more, I propose, it was certainly there were unhealthy living conditions, and overcrowded, and tenement buildings were horrible places to live. The building codes regulations there, so building codes regulations and infrastructure together are necessary to create livable densities, and also access to open space, which we heard about earlier. There is another thing that is affecting our cities is population trends, populations. Interestingly, so this is a chart of the New York metropolitan region, housing starts, and you'll see in 1992, at the bottom, New York City, which is the thick dark line, had about 7% of all the housing starts in the whole region, and there were over 70, almost 77% were taking place outside in the urban fringe. We were sprawling enormously. That was due to a particular cultural phenomenon at that time, and the perception that cities were unsafe, and we were going through a financial crisis, et cetera. Let's look at it today. So today, now, over 60% of all housing starts are in New York City, and the suburban fringe is down to 20%. So what happened? What happened is that baby boomers who are retiring now want to live in cities. They want to be in what's called EDS and near EDS and MEDS, education and medical. I have a friend who, instead of retiring to Florida, and I've heard more and more of this, as he would, retired to Brooklyn to be near his grandkids. I'm hearing more and more about that. And so there's that population, and then what's called the bright flight. So bright young people simply don't want to live in the suburbs. They want to be where Google is, they want to be where the jobs are, they want to be where the future is, they want to be where their friends are, they want to be where in a place is action. Those are the two growing bulges in the real estate market, and they are driving the growth of cities all across the country. By the way, even Detroit is actually having positive population growth. I'm going to skip this section. And the last kind of big trend I want to talk to you about, then I'm going to talk about how we deal with all these trends, is something called collective consumption. So we are moving from, so what happened when I showed you the Jacob Riis photo was people said that there was too much sharing going on. You know, there were 20 people, literally 20 people he documented to a room or to an apartment. And people said, I need my own space. I want my own, the children of the people and the grandchildren of the people who lived in Jacob Riis's buildings were the ones who moved to Levittown and said, I want, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, I want to have my own house. I want to have my own space. I want to have my own car. But that is shifting now. And we're seeing this amazing shared consumption. So Zipcar is an example of it, where young people all of a sudden say, I don't need to own my own car. I'm happy to have a car service. And by the way, what's so great about Zipcar is if I need a truck one day, I got it. If I want to impress somebody with a BMW, I got it. And if I want to drive the cheap Nissan, the next day I got it. And if I don't need anything for 3 months, I don't have to pay the parking bills and the insurance bill, et cetera. So we're seeing this. How many of you have heard of hubs? These shared office space centers. So there's a whole emergence in shared office spaces. We're going to see much more the collective sharing of things. And there's two interests. You can't do that without data. The reason Zipcar works is because there's a whole web system that's tracking all of them and your needs, and it's balancing it all. But it also takes a different state of mind that is a much more flexible state of mind that says, I am willing to participate in an economy that's going to give me many more benefits and access to much more stuff when I need it, but I don't have to own it. Okay, so all this, and I told you this earlier, is about really moving from static systems, like owning my own car, to dynamic systems. Dynamic systems are much more resilient. Remember I told you earlier that the key to dealing with the stresses of globalization, climate change, population growth, and everything else that is coming at us is resilience. Dynamic systems are much more resilient, and they have feedback loops. They have the ability to see what's going on, take real data, and feed it back, and therefore adjust to desired outcomes. There is a phenomenon now called the Internet of Things. How many people have heard of that? Okay, so about half the data in the world now comes from you sending emails and stuff that human beings do. But half the data is coming from like the remote sensors in the Antarctic that's looking at the weather, or satellites, or Google Earth, et cetera. And that's going to increase. It's called the Internet of Things. And the data coming over the Internet of Things will increase. And that gives us the ability to both see what's going on and have real-time control. So to me, the smart city is using multiple indicators of community and individual health and well-being as both inputs and goals. So let's talk about that. There's a movement now called community health indicators. And what it's saying is, we used to look at job creation, at GDP, at sales tax revenues. There had a bunch of indicators that for many decades kind of told us about the health of the city. But they didn't tell us whether our people were happier or better off. They didn't really, you could have, for example, it turns out that Des Moines, Iowa has, because Warren Buffett lives there, and a bunch of people who invest in Berkshire Hathaway, has more billionaires per population than any other place in the world, apparently. But it doesn't mean, that distorts the data. It's good for them, but it's not necessarily good for everybody. So we need to establish community health indicators. These could be about graduation rates, because and not only just graduating, but academic excellence, because we now know that to compete for the future, we have to be smart. America is now, high school students are 47th in math and science around the world, which means there's 46 other countries that if their labor costs are cheaper than ours, that's where the jobs are going to go. So we need to know about education levels. We need to know about how well our hospitals are performing. We need to know about quality of life. We need to know about obesity, a whole series of factors. But, excuse me, if we understand these, open space, quantity of open space per population, we can then begin, and if we set these as goals, that we want to improve our functioning on these indicators, we can then adjust things like zoning, things like the way we're investing public resources, both on the capital side and the operating side. We can begin to adjust regulations, et cetera, in a real-time way and begin to shift ourselves to actually get the desired outcomes. And we should be doing this with land use, with infrastructure, with the allocation of capital, economic, social, and natural capital. And we need to do this planning. Remember I talked earlier about the nested level of scales. So On a site, we heard earlier today about some smart buildings in which you're really getting tremendous benefits of feedback. The block, the community, we heard about block and community level at the Atlantic Yards and at the Hudson Yards, at the borough level, city and regional. So here's what it looks like. If you look on the far left, we established the community health indicators. By the way, there should be a community-based process to do that and a public process. And then we plan with it. And this is, by the way, something for, if you look at New York City, not just city planning and EDC, but it's really all the Department of Health in every way, the HPD, all the ways that we need to plan in an integrated way. This should then influence how we're going to regulate, invest, and create incentives, and those will create outcomes. And we should measure those outcomes, compare them to our indicators, and then shift what we're doing. We may, by the way, have so many PhDs, we have too many, and we decide to shift that indicator, the preference for education, towards something else. I hope we get to that situation, particularly for all kids in the public school system. So that is the dynamic plan. Now, we heard today, and John made a very good point, that our buildings are not the consumers of energy, that humans are the consumers of energy. And in fact, I want to talk a little bit about how you shift human behavior. Because if you think about it, these things I just mentioned over here, which were regulation, incentives, and investment, which are the main tools that cities use. So regulation says, don't do that, that's bad. Incentive says, here's something I want you to do, I'm actually going to pay you. Or, for example, in San Francisco, they said, any LEED Gold office building that comes before us will give a building permit in a week. So all of a sudden, every new office building designed in San Francisco is LEED Gold. They did not, by the way, even have to pay anything for it. So incentives don't always have to be just money, and how we choose to invest. So those are the tools that cities use. But the way we receive those tools as human beings is through the nature of our minds. And our minds have these things called cognitive biases. This is just a list of some. You can Google lists. There's all kinds of interesting lists. But these are ways that we are pre-wired. Now, some of that wiring is cultural, and some of that wire is actually neurological, and some of it is cognitive, so kind of mental models. I'm going to give you some examples of these. But these actually deeply affect how we think and how we make choices. And the idea that humans are economically rational is totally false. Our goal is not to maximize money. That's actually not the way people function. I'll give you an example. In Switzerland, it was part of the culture to donate to donate blood. And all of a sudden, a cultural shift, because Switzerland's the home of the Red Cross. And people started donating less and less blood. So they said, people are economically rationalized, we'll pay them. So they offered people 20 francs for blood donations. And blood donations plummeted. And why? The reason they plummeted is because all of a sudden it took it out of the be a good guy social motivator part of the brain, and it put it into the money part of the brain. And the money part of the brain said, to have somebody stick something in my arm and go through this whole blood donation thing, it's not worth 20 francs. Whereas the social motivation part of the brain said it was worth whatever it took. So we've learned, there's a whole lot of studies about this, but they show that financial motivation is not necessarily the strongest. I don't want to say financial motivation is meaningless. Don't take that. There's a lot of ways that financial motivation is meaningful. But interestingly, financial motivation goes through a part of the brain that is the addiction center. So for example, if you and I were to exchange apples and oranges, and we just kind of figured out how many apples were worth an orange, et cetera, that would go through a kind of, you and me doing that together would go through a social network part of the brain. And if you and I just decided to do it through money, buying and selling the apples and oranges, it would go through the addictive part of the brain, and you would actually come up with a different result on the trade of apples and oranges by having them go through the medium of money. So we need to understand how to use money and also how to not use money. I'll give another one, number 3 here, opt-in versus opt-out. So in Europe, about half the countries say that if you die in a car accident and you check on your driver's license that you want your organs donated, they'll be donated. And the other half the countries say your organs are automatically donated, and you have to check to say you don't want them donated. So guess what happens? In the countries where you have to check to donate, You have to make that positive choice. About 7% of the people choose to donate their organs. In the countries we have to check to not donate, 7% of the people choose to not donate. And it's not just because only 7% of the people bother to check. It is also because the question itself presents a social norm. The question itself kind of says, well, everybody donates their organs. Do you kind of want to be a creep and not? So this is called choice architecture. The point about all this, I'm not going to go through all these cognitive biases, except to say that when we really get to doing behavior shifting, which is what we were hearing about with these feedback systems, the smart plugs, et cetera, we need to design them with understanding how the human mind works. When we want to design financial incentives and new zoning regulations, we need to design them with an understanding of how the human mind works so that they're going to be most effective. I'm going to skip this. This is just a little side comment to me. So the EIS system is actually the worst way to plan cities because number one is reactive. Because somebody comes up with an idea, a developer, they want to do their idea. They don't want to do some other idea. They want to do their idea. And the whole EIS is biased to sell their idea. The whole program is designed by lawyers, not by planners. It's reactive, not proactive. It's static, not dynamic. And I challenge, how many people here are affiliated with a university? Raise your hands. I have a project that I would love one of you to do, please, to go and take 10 EISs that were done 10 and 20 years ago and backtest them. Actually look at what they said was going to happen and then compare it to what did happen. I've said this in dozens of speeches. So far, nobody has done it. But it is my deep belief that you will find that an EIS is just about completely inaccurate in predicting the actual outcome, that the methodologies are actually not correct, and yet we spend millions of dollars on projects going through a process. I would really, really love it if one of you would undertake that study, because I think it'd be, and then we should ask, so what is the true and appropriate predictive system? So I want to go to some questions. So I'm going to just end with this final thing. And this is an image that the people of Portland, Oregon came up for what they felt was the future of their city. So for Portland, it's denser. That's a green building kind of in the center. It's a mixed income building. See, it has windmills on the roof. You'll see that there's a light rail system, there's a bus system, and there's a car. So they're saying we want multiple choices in transportation. You'll see that there's a vendor selling local fruits and vegetables, and the vendor is of ethnic diversity. They're saying we want to be connected to our region, we want local food. So they have captured in this image the vision that they want for the future of their city. And I would bet that most of us could not come, and by the way, when you go to Portland, kind of everybody agrees, this is what we want Portland to become. And I bet you we don't have that for New York. And I think it would be really, really smart for us to do that, because when you have a sense of where you want to go, then you can begin to steer yourself to get there. So with that, I'm going to see if there are any questions. Yes. What do I think energy price volatility will do to globalization? I think that globalization is independent of energy price volatility. What I do hope that energy price volatility will do is it'll drive us towards more energy efficient buildings. And by the way, there's a hardware side to that, which is just using more insulation, using better windows, using the sunshades, a lot of things we saw earlier. And there's a software side to it, which is giving people feedback so they can shift their behavior. And you put those together, the whole smarter city from buildings and cities, I actually believe is part of the key of using less energy. I believe that you'll see a big drive for more and more countries to become more energy independent, but they will be increasingly still financially interdependent. Yes?
What do you think about this knowledge gap jumping? Like, I think John Gill was talking about Zigbee, and recently I've been looking a little bit like solar thermals and Zigbee and Z-Wave. It seems like there aren't a lot of people that are really, really well informed on these things to roll it out, like architects and project managers. It seems like just the most basic things.
Well, if you need a project manager that actually understands all this stuff, talk to Kristen Neal from our company sitting over there. But what we're seeing is that the world is rapidly, so knowledge is shifting very, very quickly, but the truth is people are catching up. This is very, very important. You can't learn everything on your own. And one of the great things we've learned about social media is that you can learn a lot in a collective situation. So become a member of the New York chapter, the District Council of ULI, or join the U.S. Green Building Council, or it is really through organizations, or continue coming to events at SHAC. It's these kinds of events that are the most efficient at distributing knowledge. One of my favorite things to do is read environmental building news, but you'll never be able to figure it all out. But the industry we are seeing, okay, so remember I said we have these three things: regulations, so green building regulations push us forward, incentives, nicer incentives, et cetera, kind of then move us more forward. But where we're really going to learn the most is by meetings with peers. Yes?
Yeah, could you expand a little on your firm's approach to community planning and how it incorporates human behavior to arrive at visions like Green Future Portland?
Great, thank you. Okay, so our company does four things in one. We do planning, project management, we're developers, and we're investors. We do the project management for others. And so, for example, we're the master planners now. We're doing a new master plan for the city of Newark. First of all planning processes, we believe you need to set goals, like the community health indicators, and to really work in a broad base of community-based input. So you really need to listen to a wide range of stakeholders, from business, local citizens, et cetera. The issue is, the hard part, there's then something called scenario planning. Does everybody know what scenario planning is? So it's a way of saying, what's the future going to be like? Let's test different alternative scenarios, like high energy prices, low energy prices, high interest rates, low interest rates. And you try and project different scenarios so that you can see the outcomes of your plans, so that you can then kind of get a sense of what the range of impacts are going to be, so that you can create a plan that's going to be more resilient. But one of the key things, though, in all of our work is, number one, we use as affordable energy efficiency as possible. So that means things like insulation in buildings or in cities. The second thing is you want multiple pathways of connectivity. So I mentioned multiple versions of mass transit, having walkable communities, et cetera. And the third thing is building in real-time feedback systems. So for example, on the building level, our company just finished a building called the Tapestry. We've put in half the building has smart outlets made by a company called ThinkEco. You heard about, John mentioned these earlier. And half the units have just regular outlets. And what we're now doing is a test to see what's the difference we're doing this with Columbia University, in the energy performance of the units between the people who can actually go on their iPhone and turn off their stereo when they're sitting here versus the people who can't. So we're going to actually be able to quantify. And this building's a 50-30-20, 50% market rate, 30% moderate income, 20% low income, so that we'll be able to compare it across income groups too. Yes, in the back.
Just wondering if you might be able to expand on your last comment about the vision, the shared vision for
Right.
New York City. And I think the inference is that doesn't really exist here, and I'm wondering why. Because Plan YC 2030 really addresses a lot of the things that are in green markets and bus rapid transit and the expansion of bike lanes and electric vehicles, so on and so forth. And so do you really think that we haven't yet captured that in Plan YC 2030?
So let me ask this question differently. How many people in the room think that Plan NYC 2030 represents the common vision of New York? Okay, a few hands, few tentative hands. And how many people think it doesn't? That's a test to see who isn't raising hand. But more than half of you, by the way, didn't raise your hand for either. So the reason is, I think it's a fabulous plan, actually. And it was the benchmark. A lot of cities are doing great green planning now, but when it came out, it was clearly the best of all of them. But it was created quietly and internally and then unleashed to the public. I bet you that 90% of New York's citizens don't really know what it is, or don't really know its content, or don't really know what it offers them. They may even have trees just planted on their street and don't really get that it's part of a whole larger thing. Unfortunately, to create a common vision, you have to really do common engagement. It's a very big city. It's a tough place to do. City planning is doing an amazing job of neighborhood by neighborhood planning. This administration has done more neighborhood plans, I believe, than any other. And the community has been very engaged in those plans. We need some process to kind of sum that up. Typically, when that's been done, the only way it can be done on a city or regional basis is you need to engage the media. You can't simply do it in town hall meetings. You need to engage the media. So where you see this in other places in the country, the local newspapers, the local TV stations, everybody kind of takes ownership of it. And there's a time period in which really there's this collective sense that we're figuring out our future. And often what has happened, for example, in something called Envision Utah, you end up doing this poll that says, here's 3 or 4 alternative futures, and literally hundreds of thousands or millions of people vote. And interestingly, they always vote for the best one. The people intuitively really are smart. Yes?
In a large city like New York, how do you balance the time-intensive community consultation that you're speaking about, where they need to have, to make dynamic decisions? When people usually, if in a year-long process they come to agreement about something, they kind of want to stick by it for a little bit.
Right. So the goal is, what you really want people to do is to agree on value. That's why I said the process starts with the community health indicators. So you really want them to start with what is it they want to achieve, but then you kind of need to get them, I don't want to say out of the way. You need to keep reporting on achieving those things. But if people are agreed on the goals, then you should have more flexibility on how you get to the goals, and reporting on whether you're achieving the goals or not. And I think if you really said to people, we heard that you want walkable communities, more open space, and we tried this, so for example, we're just not able to generate that many parks and gardens, so we're now moving to smart streets with more, I think I have a picture of a smart street here. Here, this is in Barcelona. So here's a street in which they actually took out a bunch of the driving lanes, and they actually added mass transit. There's a streetcar down the center, they added a park down the center, bike lanes, etc. So you say, look, we're going to try this as another way of achieving your goal. Yes?
Just spoke briefly about this great regional rail infrastructure we have in New York region. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the relationships that you think we could have among these cities, these notable cities in the area, and how we create collaboration among cities that are right now.
Right. So is anybody here from RPA? So Regional Plan Association has been working on this since the 1920s. It's hard because we really are 3, and when you throw in Philadelphia, getting to be 4 states that are really part of the New York metropolitan region. The way I've seen it best is it really, so for example, in the Denver metro area, there's a Denver metro area regional council that is 48 governors and county planning executives who actually got together and designed, they didn't have what we have, a whole new transit system. And in several cases, they've done regional taxes. The Denver metro region has a tax, for example, for cultural facilities. So everybody in the region said, having a strong version of Lincoln Center is important to us. And we're willing to tax even the suburban towns to achieve that. We're going to spread some dollars around, but we recognize some dollars are going to be locally based. So it really takes a form of regional governance, a regional collaboration at the leadership side to be able to go to have effective regions. And it typically takes a strong central mayor, like the mayor of New York, would have to really make this an objective and put a lot of personal time into it. The other thing is that the MTA system is an amazing armature, but it lacks what's called the last mile solution. So you can take the train to a town, but often from that town you can't get a great bus or alternative versions of transportation to your home or to a town center that may be 3 or 4 miles away. And so we really need to tie our regional transit system into local transit systems in a way we haven't figured out yet. Yes?
You alluded to the tunnel that Governor Christie cut off.
Right.
How do we pay for whether it's that or the bike lanes and so forth versus government spending versus investment? I think there's got to be a little test in there somewhere, I would think you would say, right?
Right. So, okay. So the first thing is the federal government really needs a capital budget versus an operating budget. And we really need to make clear to the American people that there's a difference between an investment in rail and or other infrastructure versus expenditures on things like interest or military uniforms. Not that those are bad things; those are all necessary things. So we need a capital budget. I deeply believe we need a capital budget. And then there's an issue of political language. How many people know there's a thinker named George Lakoff? He just wrote a column recently on this whole issue in which the Republicans have called everything an expenditure, a deficit increasing expenditure. So it automatically has a negative taint. And we really need a language that says, by the way, the most important test case was in Florida, where the governor also cut off the new high-speed rail system, and the rail system was almost entirely paid for by the federal government. There were zero cost overruns because some major private companies were guaranteeing the construction costs, the operating costs, and delivering it cost overrun free for the next 30 years. And so the excuse that it was a potential liability was just an excuse. So this is really a political discussion, and what we need is leaders at the city, state, and federal levels to be advocating for this investment. I'm going to give you an example of this disconnect. So the people of Oklahoma City have now voted 5 times in a row when it's come up on their ballots over the last 10 or 12 years to increase local real estate and sales taxes to pay for parks, sidewalks, walkable streets, and a light rail system. And at the same time, their senators have been the ones who've been most vociferous about killing any climate change funding, any gas tax increase, or anything that could possibly pay for what their very constituents are voting to pay for. And somehow that bridge between the local politics and the national politics has not happened. My sense the solution is we have to figure out how to get all the mayors and local communities who really understand the need for infrastructure to get that voice up to state and federal level.